Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The military government of Mali in West Africa appears to be turning away from European help and embracing Russia. And in an area known for unrest and the influence of jihadi groups, there's concern for international stability. The European Union is suspending military training because of the regime's close associations with Russian mercenaries known as the Wagner Group, and that, it's claimed, could let Moscow get even closer. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The junta, now in control of the former French colony, has been accused by Paris of neglecting the fight against extremists, of using the Wagner Group to keep itself in power. Well, the Wagner mercenaries, alongside its claim the Malian military, are alleged to have committed atrocities, including in March in the town of Moura, where 300 died, many of them civilians. The Malian army denies killing any civilians and has opened an investigation. Yet how will the decision to suspend training for the Malian army affect security in that country and the wider Sahel region? Let's head to West Africa, to Dakar, the capital of Senegal, and there we see Oluwole Ojewale, Regional Organised Crime Observatory Coordinator at the West Africa office of the Institute for Security Studies. And in Paris, Emmanuel Dupuy, Institute of European Perspective and Security, just back from Mali. With me in the studio, Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow at the Africa Programme at Chatham House. I'll come to you in just a moment, Paul, because this is your area, geographical area of expertise. But since you are in Africa, in West Africa, Wally, I want to come to you first of all. And we're talking about an area from east to west of thousands of kilometres. And it's a very broad question. How dangerously unstable are parts of that area that we're talking about, the Sahel?
Thank you so much, David. I think the entire Sahel, starting from the edge of Mauritania to Eritrea in the Horn of Africa, is largely caught up in all kinds of insecurity now. And that is largely informed by an array of factors. The number one thing is the increasing presence of ISWAP that is trying to establish a presence across this wide expanse geography. And then the second thing is tied to the geostrategic tension that is going on now, particularly between the countries in the West, and Russia has the arrowhead in the eastern part of Europe. Because we can't divorce what is going on in this entire Sahel now without making reference to that, because of the increasing exertion of the presence of Russia, particularly through the Wagner Group. That is the number one thing. The second thing is that it has also become a point where everyone seems to turn to now in terms of getting security alliances, which is actually failing from the West. So you have issues of porosity of borders, which is also linked to the fall of Gaddafi over a decade ago, and then proliferation of harm across the Sahel. Just less than 24 hours ago, about 100 persons were reportedly killed in Burkina Faso. It has largely become a daily experience in Nigeria, in Mali, and we are increasingly becoming concerned because even the coastal nations of the Sahel, I mean, the West African coastal nations like Ghana, Benin Republic, Togo. I think a few days ago, Togo just declared a state of emergency because they've started experiencing things that are not dotting the landscape in the last 4 or 5 years. So I think, I would like to submit, what is happening in pockets of these countries as at now cannot be addressed in isolation. There's a need for regional cooperation. And I think ECOWAS need to garner all the external support it can get from external forces to be able to secure the entire Sahel now. But I think to anchor on one point, I would say the entire Sahel is in a serious crisis now.
Which leads me, sorry to interrupt, to throw in this from the European Union Foreign Policy Chief, Joseph Borrell, talking about alleged European proximity to these atrocities that you're talking about, and the reason for the EU pulling out. Clearly, our training mission cannot be implicated in any way in activities that call into question the European Union's reputation. In what sense, Paul, does this besmirch the European Union when nobody's saying they were involved at all?
No one is saying they were involved at the moment, but the challenge that the European Union faced, the difficult decision it faced, is that after the original security collapse in Mali, almost a decade ago now, and then the subsequent French and African intervention to restore government authority, at least nominally, over the towns in the north in the country, the EU set up a training mission to retrain the Malian army. And so for most of the past decade, this mission, the EUTM, has been retraining units of the Malian army so that they can better cope with the challenge from
This is
jihadist
what's known
groups.
as the Barkhane Force.
No, this is the EUTM mission.
Barkhane Force is allied to this, or?
So you have several different military forces at play. You have the Barkhane Force, which is the French military force, which has been operating across the Sahel.
That's staying put?
It's staying in the region, but it's pulling out of Mali. Then you have the European Union Training Mission, EUTM, which was originally just focused on Mali, but is now going to pull out. And then you have set up really in the last 2 or 3 years, but also pulling out of Mali specifically, Takuba, which are special forces from a number of European countries, some French troops, but also Estonian, Czech, Italian, Swedish, and so on.
So it's multinational and multidimensional. My question, having heard what Joseph Borrell had to say, was in what way does this besmirch the European missions, if you like, out there? So I'm going to follow that up by saying, does the withdrawal, if you like, make it a more dangerous area rather than safer?
Well, the practical challenge that the Europeans faced was that specifically for the training mission, because they're training Malian troops, is that in the last few months, the last 6 months basically, Human Rights Watch and also local communities, particularly in what's called the center of Mali, that's the sort of area, the waist of the country, if you like, between Burkina Faso and Mauritania. In that zone, the Malian army and Russian security contractors who are now deployed from Wagner alongside them have been accused of human rights abuses, particularly targeting the Peul ethnic group who are mostly involved in livestock herding. And the European Union, as the people who've been training the Malian army, didn't want to be associated with any suggestion that they had, as it were,
okay, so they want to be squeaky clean, but by pulling out, are they making the place more dangerous?
Well, it's hard to say because on one level they probably are making it more dangerous, but politically it was already very difficult because at the same time there's been a breakdown in the political relationship between the Malian government and both the Western European countries, principally France, but not just France, the other countries in the Takuba force and so on, and a breakdown in the relations between Mali and ECOWAS, as it were, the West African equivalent of the European Union. So Mali has
But it's more economic, isn't
politically,
it? It's Europe, economic community of West African states.
It's nominally economic, but its biggest mission is actually regional security. And that relationship has broken down over, basically in Mali, there have been a couple of military coups in 2020 and then again last year. And the discussion over how Mali should move back to democratic rule, that has broken down.
Which leads us, if I may interrupt, it leads us, because Emmanuel, I want to bring you in because you've just come back, I think 10 days ago from Mali. And we've made reference to what are alleged to be civilian massacres. We're going to play in some footage now, apparently obtained from the French army, filming from a drone, which apparently shows Russian mercenaries burying bodies. That's near the Gossi base in northern Mali. French army says the aim was to accuse the French of having left a mass grave behind. I want to ask you about what kind of political seesawing you found when you were in Mali and whether you noticed that the military junta was trying to get closer to the Russians who are accused of doing this sort of thing.
Well, you have mentioned the Moura massacre, which happened in last of March. and to abiding by that, the tentative to put that responsibility on the French forces, withdrawing from one of the 6 bases we had since 2014, when Serval became Barkhane mission, namely the Gossi base, which was closed in last of March, end of March. But of course, there is, as the United Nations has mentioned in its report, very recent report, the 2nd of June, a certain number of very preoccupying realities. With the withdrawal of the French forces, the security is still very high. This insecurity is still very high. Insecurity against the local population. This was the case with the Moura massacre and the responsibility of the
and are the Russians, the Wagner group and Russian influence from the Kremlin trying to make the situation for the civilian population more difficult because the military junta needs Russian help to stay in power?
I'm not sure the Russians are here to make the situation better for the Malian population. I think the Russian contractors are there because they have been contracted by the Malian authorities with the help of with the Russian government. And of course, as you very well know, there's no such thing as a contract. They are there on the basis of an agreement between Moscow and the transitional power, which took power in March 2020. And again, trying to keep this power for 2 next years. This was one of the conclusions that was announced and a disappointing point by the international community.
I suppose my point here is are the Russians needed to prop up the military junta?
Well, Wagner is there for the compliance of a certain number of military agreements which were signed between Russia and Mali in June 2019, before President Assimi Goïta and Prime Minister Kokala Shogun Maïga took power. And of course, we're not speaking about the same thing. The reality is very simple. As we are speaking, there's been a huge increase. United Nations has said that during the last report, between this report and the last report, which was the 30th of March, last March, there was an increase of more than 400% in the attacks against the civilians. And of course, this is in coordination with the fact that French are leaving and therefore are in more difficulty to fight against the insurgents.
Okay. Let's talk about general instability, Wole, if I may. Your area of expertise is organized crime, but that encompasses all kinds of security matters. We're going to throw up on the screen a map that goes from West Africa across to Chad. You talked about to the Horn of Africa, in fact, where you see problems in the Sahel region. But we're going to mention a few Islamic groups there. Ansar al-Islam, that is principally down in Burkina Faso, Boko Haram in Niger, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, that's in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and Jamaat Nusra, that appears to be in Mali and in Burkina Faso. These groups are not simply ideological. This is what I want you to comment on, because organized crime being your speciality. They are, if you like, economic powerhouses using trafficking and drug smuggling, et cetera, to build up their base. So it's an impossible operation, isn't it, to try and shut them down?
Yes, like you have rightly said, these groups that you just mentioned now are littered all over the places in West Africa, and then only a few of them are actually ideologically motivated for doing what they are doing. I think what we're witnessing is a large-scale criminality, which is assuming different coloration, and that is taking place in the context of failure of governance or weak governance across these countries and ungoverned spaces that you have rightly mentioned. And what we are actually witnessing now is that this entire swath of land has now become a festering point for criminal economy. So rather than pursuing any ideological posture, these groups are rather profiting from this. And then a few of them are also taking advantage of the vacancy that has been created by absence, what I would call government absenteeism.
Okay,
within
I'm
the
sorry to butt in, but I wanted to, Emmanuel, you were raising your hand like a very polite person. I think you probably wanted to comment on something that Wole has said. I was going to bring in Paul next, but quickly, if you wouldn't mind, Emmanuel.
No, I mean, this is very important because the accuracy or the lack of states is the fuel of this terrorist organization. They are not only Salafi or only jihadist motivated, they can be considered by some as insurgency, local insurgency, northern septentrional insurgency in Mali and in Niger, or as well in northeast and northwest of Nigeria. What is important that at the same time they are litigating one against each other. You have on one side organization linked to Islamic State, which is the case of ISWAP, which is the case of Islamic State in Greater Sahara, and you have on the other side more traditional, more linked to Algerian terrorism, or of course, as a result of the Libyan unrest in 2011, organization linked to Al-Qaeda. So there's a form of generation opposition between themselves, and of course, radicalization inside ethnical groups. There is.
Okay, so it's a hodgepodge. There are rivalries. Wole, I would love to come back to you in just a moment, and I promise you I won't leave you out, but Paul's been sitting here extremely patiently. And I want to ask about, see, if we've got this melting pot, if you like, of very nasty elements, this awful recipe, right the way across the belt of Africa, if you like, what do the Russians see themselves getting out of this? Is this a bigger package of influence being sponsored by Moscow, or is it just insurgencies within Mali and smaller areas where they hope to create instability and influence?
Well, I think, and looking at it from an Africa perspective, if you like, the perception is that Russia wants to make itself count. Vladimir Putin wants to restore Russia as a serious player, and West Africa was a region where the Russians had essentially no influence in recent years until the last year or two.
Are we talking about since the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, for a long time they've had very little influence. And by contrast, there's been a huge and sustained Western effort, and particularly European effort, a very, very big effort by the European Union and its member states to invest in the development and stabilization of West Africa. The partnership between ECOWAS and the EU, the security partnerships that have been built up. If you look at the G5 alliance of Sahelian countries launched 5 or 6 years ago, that was essentially launched by those countries in partnership with Brussels and Paris. So from the Russians' point of view, they want to disrupt that. But
two particular reasons for that, I would suggest. One is that they can see economic advantages, and secondly, they can see themselves preventing the exporting of destabilizing influences across North Africa into Europe.
I'm not sure that they're really preventing the export of destabilizing. I mean, there isn't much economic opportunity. One needs to remember these are some of the poorest countries in the world. And although there are some gold reserves and in Niger uranium, basically this isn't a big economic play. The tragedy is that underneath it is a huge societal and development crisis, that the Sahel is on the edge of the Sahara Desert. It's feeling the effects of climate change. Population is rising, the pressure on land, water, the competition for those very basic resources, farmers against herders, for example, that's really intensifying. And we're seeing, beneath the jihadist groups, we're seeing a tragic social crisis. I was at a briefing in Burkina Faso a few months ago where someone was talking about one of these attacks on a village. And the villager who was talking about this reported that nearly all of the attackers, they were young teenage boys of 12 or 14. These were not sort of wild, committed ideologues. These are, as it were, disoriented young people who got mixed up in awful criminal violence. And the effect, of course, was that the very fragile grassroots development model of the Sahel, where people do, despite the droughts, despite all the poverty, they nevertheless have been growing their own food. They do have a local trading economy. They do have their livestock. And that model is being tragically undermined and broken up by this really spiraling, not just the ideological level, but the model that you can't have a grassroots development model amidst violent instability, and that is destroying them.
Going to come back to you in a moment and ask you about the United Nations Security Council. It's been discussing this. It's got to decide whether its mission in Mali is going to remain. That'll be in just a moment. Wole, just after Emmanuel finished speaking, you very politely also raised your hand, and I very rudely ignored you for a few minutes. So say what it was you wanted to say then, and then we'll get on to other matters.
Yes, I was just about to hank on the fact that these these social crises that I was trying to lean on, particularly when you stretch the argument to Nigeria, where you have Ansaru, you have the HISWAP, who, out of their benevolent posture, seems to be providing services to these local communities, basic services that government ought to be providing in the first place. Then you see a situation whereby this government absenteeism is creating a void that this group are trying to now fill now. And it's making it easier for them to also get the local buy-in, to buy into their ideas, to buy into their operations. And then it makes it easier for them to recruit within the community. And that is the reason why you see what is playing out. In northwest Nigeria, which shares border with Niger Republic, which is part of the Central Sahara. Young boys are being recruited for as low as less than $15 because of the economic vulnerability that they were being subjected to. And to the extent to which state is not taking up this responsibility at national and subnational level, what you continue to witness is the degeneration of the society, and then insecurity continues to fester.
All right.
And this is linked.
I'm sorry for cutting you short, but we have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I want to get both our other guests to have a final say on this one. Emmanuel, France is doing what to help prevent this situation getting worse?
Well, France is redeploying, and I'm using the words that the French president used when he said he was going to shift from a very robust pre-position that the French forces have been accomplishing since January 2014, Sahara mission, and August 2014, the widespread of that from Mali to the neighboring state, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger. The next step, as it was mentioned by our colleague from Nigeria, is taking in consideration that there's been a wider spreading of the insurgency inside the Gulf of Benin states. Togo, which launched its state of emergency a few days ago. Benin, of course, where 2 French citizens have been kidnapped not less than 2 years ago. And of course, attacks which occurred in 2015 in Ivory Coast, and some new attacks in the north part of the country, as well as in the western part of Senegal, in Kaolack, during the last 2 years in Senegal. So there is a sort of new perception that the terrorist organizations are spreading wider and wider, that they are recruiting on local basis more and more. We are fearing, and this is a French perspective, that the withdrawal of the French forces from Mali and their repositioning in Niger is fueling a new form of insurgency, maybe an Islamic State in Niger, with insurgents coming from Niger, which is not the case of Islamic State in Greater Sahara, where you have more or less people coming from the southern part of Morocco, Mali, and Algeria.
I get the picture you're painting, and it's a very worrying one. Emmanuel, thank you very much indeed. I promised to bring you back in, Paul, at the end to ask about what the UN's planning to do. Meeting of the Security Council got to decide whether, in fact, its mission in Mali remains. What can it do to prevent more of this social disintegration?
Well, the UN has a development agenda, of course, coordinated with both African and external partners. But in order to do development, you need security. And it's very interesting at a time when, obviously, as we've been discussing, those French and other European forces are pulling out of Mali. Now the UN is saying, in the meeting last night of the Security Council, top UN officials are saying, we need to keep MINUSMA, the United Nations peacekeeping force, in Mali there. And that's going to be a very tough decision, because the decision has to be reached by the end of this month. But if MINUSMA, the UN force, was to pull out, then there wouldn't be any other external forces except the Russians. And the UN has taken the decision that although operating conditions are really difficult, it needs to stay in place. And interestingly, Germany has actually offered to increase its troop contribution to that force. So that argument seems to be carrying some weight. And Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has also speculated about the possibility of, as it were, an African warfighting force that presumably could operate alongside the UN and perhaps take the place that the French were playing before of protecting that UN force.
The geopolitics of it all are quite extraordinary and have been going on not for years, but for generations. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for that. But on a human level, it's quote Sadia Touré. She's from Mali Musso, briefing the Security Council on civil society in Mali. She said, women are not safe anywhere. Schools have closed, affecting some 450,000 teenagers, making teenagers easy recruits for armed groups. I summarised there, but it's a warning to the international community as to how dangerous it can be in that part of Africa. Listen, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Senegal, from Paris, Paul here in the studio, and thank you very much wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. Thank you. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.